the secret psychology cults use on anyone. The moment of realization. The room was silent except for the hum of the computer fans. Rows of identical bunk beds lined the walls. On the desk stood a small, plastic model of a spaceship, silver, sleek, waiting. One of the Heaven's Gate members, eyes wide with calm certainty, typed their final message to the world, believing they were about to transcend this planet forever. But in the days that followed, that promise of transcendence would end in death, not deliverance. Among those who walked away before that final act was a man named Sawyer. Years later, he confessed in an interview, "The moment I realized that the truth wasn't truth at all, my mind split open." That moment, when a narrative collapses, when certainty shatters, is where this story begins. What does it take for intelligent, well-educated, deeply spiritual people to lose their sense of self so completely? That's not just a question about cults. It's a question about us. Because the same psychological forces that draw people into movements like Heaven's Gate, belonging, transcendence, meaning, are the same ones that drive every human search for purpose. The difference is in how those desires are shaped, mirrored, and turned back on us. In the mid-199s, Heaven's Gate promised a new evolution of humanity. To its followers, it wasn't madness, it was clarity. Marshall Applewhite, the group's leader, spoke with calm conviction. Earth was a contaminated classroom, and salvation lay in leaving the human behind to ascend to the next level. To question him was to question cosmic truth itself. Members gave up jobs, families, even names, replacing their pasts with obedience. From the inside, it didn't feel like control, it felt like devotion. Psychologists call that moment of intense revelation an identity eclipse. When one's search for self merges with a grand, all-encompassing belief system, boundaries blur. Dr. Janja Lalick, one of the world's leading experts on cult dynamics, calls this bounded choice. When every decision feels voluntary, but exists entirely inside the leader's constructed frame of reality. It's not brainwashing, she explains. It's the systematic narrowing of what's thinkable. Applewhite didn't demand blind loyalty immediately. He cultivated it through meaning. Members believed they were joining a mission to save humanity. Only later did they realize they had surrendered their ability to define truth itself. In footage recorded weeks before the mass suicide, the group members smile serenely. Their words are measured, confident. They thank the camera for the chance to share their joy. There's no hint of fear. That's what's most haunting, not madness, but peace. The peace of people who believed they finally knew. But that certainty was the ultimate prison, one built from their own yearning. So let's linger on the real question. Why did this make sense to them? Heaven's Gate members weren't ignorant or unstable. Many were intelligent, thoughtful, spiritually curious. Some were programmers, teachers, artists. They were seekers, ordinary people drawn by promises of belonging in an era of growing alienation. The late 20th century was wired with new technology, social fragmentation, and existential doubt. Meaning felt like it was dissolving. Applewhite stepped into that void and offered cosmic order. Each of us carries that same hunger, to find something larger, to escape the noise of uncertainty. That's why cult psychology isn't just a study of extremes. It's a mirror. The tactics of control aren't exotic. They're amplified forms of what already moves us: connection, purpose, love. But when those needs are met by someone who claims exclusive access to truth, manipulation blooms inside that trust. And so, in that quiet California mansion in 1997, while cameras later captured the aftermath of matching uniforms and covered bodies, the true horror wasn't the act itself. It was how rational it felt before it happened. The chilling realization came later, for those who escaped. What had once promised freedom had become an invisible cage around their minds. This documentary begins there, in the moment of realization. We'll follow the psychological architecture that turns searching into surrender, from the first spark of idealism to the engineered collapse of identity. Because to understand how 3,000 minds could be reprogrammed across countless movements, we have to see the common blueprint. Meaning, belonging, isolation, reform, obedience, and finally liberation. But maybe the most uncomfortable truth is this. The mechanisms of control that build a cult can also exist in everyday spiritual systems, motivational movements, even social circles that promise enlightenment. The difference lies not in belief, but in whether you're allowed to think beyond it. The seduction of meaning. Meaning is oxygen for the human mind. When life loses shape, when a job ends, a relationship collapses, or belief systems crumble, We crave something that puts the pieces back together. Psychologists call this existential vulnerability, the state of being open, even desperate, for a narrative strong enough to hold our fears. Cults, consciously or not, build themselves around that crack in human certainty. They don't sell control. They sell coherence. In the early days of Heaven's Gate, it wasn't death or sacrifice on the table. It was clarity. Recruits were told they were chosen participants in an intergalactic awakening. They weren't running from life. They thought they were reinventing what it meant to live. Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, his co-founder, presented themselves as teachers, not tyrants. Their message blended theology, science fiction, and self-help, promising to lift humanity beyond the corrupted level of earthly existence. At the time, seekers across America were re-evaluating religion. The counterculture wave of the 197s had fragmented faith into 1,000 pieces. Eastern mysticism, ufology, channeling, transcendental meditation. It was a buffet of transcendence, and Heaven's Gate simply offered the most extreme plate. Members were told, "You are not bodies, you are vessels preparing for the next evolutionary leap." To someone lonely or spiritually disoriented, that wasn't absurd. It was exhilarating. Dr. Janja Lalick, who studied cults for decades, describes this moment as bounded choice. A psychological contract where freedom exists only within the leader's universe. She explains it as an invisible architecture that feels open but is actually sealed. Early on, followers felt empowered. They chose to join, chose to study, chose to believe. But each choice existed inside Applewhite's cosmology, where leaving meant spiritual death. The illusion of agency was the hook. A survivor named Gail once described her first seminar in 1975 as falling in love with an idea. She'd been working in a bookstore, restless and searching. A friend invited her to a meeting. The room was warm, filled with curious people who asked smart questions. No one preached damnation. Instead, they talked about evolution, purity, love. "I remember thinking," she said later, "these people understand something I've always felt but never had words for." That's how it starts. Curiosity meets meaning, and meaning opens the door to faith. Faith, however, is pliable. It bends around the authority that defines it. Psychologists studying conversion experiences note that most recruits aren't coerced by fear, but attracted by the possibility of becoming extraordinary. Cults target the imagination, not the intellect. They promise spiritual technology, insider knowledge, or hidden wisdom. And when those promises mirror the quests you already carry, they don't feel foreign, they feel like home. In Heaven's Gate's recruitment films, Applewhite's eyes gleam with conviction. He speaks softly, almost tenderly, explaining that humanity is stuck in a recycling process and that he offers a way out. His tone isn't threatening, it's parental. For intelligent seekers, this balance of logic and mystery is magnetic. It offers structure to chaos, spirituality with rules. You could still use your computer, read science journals, and believe in UFOs that would carry your consciousness to salvation. Rationality and mysticism no longer opposed each other. They fused into a single system. This need for meaning isn't weakness, it's part of being human. Sociologists point out that when economies shift or social trust declines, movements promising certainty gain traction. In the 199s, as technology began isolating people behind screens, Heaven's Gate provided community, a digital monastery before social media existed. They compared leaving behind families to scientists shedding outdated theories. Necessary, even noble. The seduction worked because it aligned devotion with intelligence. Dr. Lalick notes that high-control groups rarely begin with overt demands. The first phase, she says, is euphoric alignment. Everything clicks. Questions are welcomed at first because each answer seems to erase confusion. Members feel elevated. The group speaks of consciousness, service, and love. Critics label this manipulation, but inside, it feels like transcendence, like graduating from confusion. Lights, rituals, new language, all serve the same function, anchoring the mind to a collective rhythm that replaces self-doubt with purpose. A sociologist once described this as existential anesthesia. The unbearable noise of daily life, bills, heartbreak, isolation, is replaced with one melody. You matter, and your life has cosmic significance. Once that melody runs deep enough, a person no longer notices who's conducting. Consider Daniel, a later recruit who joined in 1994. He was a coder, an introvert, disillusioned with corporate life. In his diaries, discovered after leaving, he wrote, For the first time, I didn't feel like an accident. That's the heart of it. Cult psychology reclaims the parts of the self that feel scattered and gives them direction. Even knowing the danger later, Daniel said he missed the early months, the peace, the unity. Meaning feels intoxicating when you've lived in confusion. But there's a pivot point where meaning stops serving the seeker and starts serving the system. Cognitive scientists describe this as narrative binding. Once a person invests identity into a worldview, contradictory evidence threatens not just belief but existence. That's why intelligent people can defend irrational doctrines. They're protecting self-cohesion, not delusion. Heaven's Gate perfected this bind by making doubt itself a sign of weakness. The seduction of meaning isn't just a cult phenomenon. Modern spirituality often follows a similar curve: gurus, influencers, or wellness leaders offering healing through exclusive insight. Most are harmless, but the mechanism is recognizable: discomfort, revelation, devotion. Each phase meets a need the previous one exposed. And when admiration becomes dependence, manipulation can feel like mentorship. Experts in social psychology warn that high arousal belief systems thrive in uncertainty. Our minds crave simplified cause and effect stories when overwhelmed. Heaven's Gate offered the grandest simplification imaginable. Everything was leading to ascension. Every hardship became proof that the test was real. Every doubt became a signal to surrender more deeply. As one survivor said, "They didn't steal our free will. They gave it meaning." That's the paradox. The group filled emptiness with certainty, so complete it became its own cage. And yet, at the time, the bars looked like beams of light. This is the first gate in the architecture of control, the seduction of meaning. It doesn't begin with threats or rules, but with promises. Every spiritual seeker who's ever asked, "Why am I here?" is, in that question, walking the same path the early members of Heaven's Gate did. The difference lies only in who answers. The next stage reveals how that answer turns into attachment. Once meaning becomes emotional, belonging becomes the drug. And when you're loved by a group that claims divine purpose, logic often steps aside. Not because you're weak, but because for a time, love feels like truth. Love bombing and the high of belonging. They called it the light. Outsiders might have seen an ordinary gathering, some hugs, shared meals, long talks stretching into the night. But for newcomers, it felt like electricity under the skin. The first weekend with Heaven's Gate wasn't about doctrine, it was about ecstasy. Every word, every smile, every shared laugh seemed charged with divine purpose. Recruits weren't questioned or criticized, they were adored. One survivor said, "I'd never been seen like that before. They looked right into you, like they could read your soul, and they liked what they saw." That's love bombing, the psychological ignition point of so many high-control groups. It's a flood of warmth, an overdose of human connection. From a neurochemical perspective, it's dopamine chaos. Acceptance triggers reward, reward triggers trust, and trust silences skepticism. In that heightened state, strangers become family, leaders become saviors, and belonging feels like a revelation. The manipulator doesn't need to convince you. You convince yourself that you've finally found home. A former member, known publicly as Rio, once recalled his first meeting. "They treated me like I was the answer they'd been waiting for," he said. "They made me believe I was special, chosen for a purpose." It was intoxicating. He'd been lonely, disconnected from family, grappling with questions no one seemed to care about. And now, suddenly, people hugged him, listened with their full attention. Meals were shared with reverence. Everything, the lighting, the tone, the smiles, was designed to create the feeling of destiny. Social psychologists describe this as attachment flooding. When positive reinforcement overwhelms personal boundaries, the recipient interprets excessive affection as intimacy, not strategy. And yet, behind that affection sits a template, the same one used by narcissistic partners, manipulative mentors, and charismatic leaders. It's not limited to cults. It's exploitation disguised as love. Heaven's Gate didn't need whips or chains. It needed praise. Each new recruit was framed as a returning traveler, a soul who'd almost completed the journey in another life. Dr. Margaret Singer, who studied cult indoctrination, explained that unconditional acceptance is the hook. "The love is real in feeling but conditional in structure," she said. "It lasts as long as compliance does. It's a contract you don't realize you've signed until the warmth turns cold." One early member wrote in her journal, "I couldn't stop smiling. They held my hands in theirs while talking about the stars. It felt like remembering something I'd forgotten." That line, "remembering something forgotten," is repeated in countless survivor testimonies. Cult recruiters craft narratives that echo buried ideals, awakening nostalgia for purpose. Belonging, once established, becomes its own logic. If so many people love you instantly, they can't be wrong, can they? Within days, recruits would start using the group's language. Ordinary compliments, "You're beautiful," "You're kind," were replaced with coded affirmations. "Your vehicle radiates purity." Applewhite called them vehicles, bodies meant to be perfected. It sounded spiritual, but it was linguistic hypnosis. Researchers call this semantic framing, altering vocabulary to reshape emotion. The term love bombing might sound cynical, but in practice it feels tender, even sacred. That's why it works. It merges personal longing with collective validation. During the first week, initiates lived in communal homes filled with rituals of care. They brushed each other's hair, shared stories of pain and redemption, and performed small acts of service. Attention was currency. Doing dishes for the group earned affection. Expressing doubt drew gentle concern that quickly morphed into exclusion. "You start chasing their smiles the way an addict chases a high," said Sawyer, the ex-member introduced earlier. "You'd do anything not to lose that feeling." The neuroscience is simple but devastating. Dopamine spikes with novelty and reward. When affection follows obedience, the brain links submission to euphoria. Over time, that link rewires motivation. You stop acting from free choice and start acting to re-experience the chemical rush of acceptance. Cult researchers compare it to intermittent reinforcement in gambling. Unpredictable, potent, and addictive. You crave the next hit of belonging, even as the conditions tighten. To someone outside, it's easy to ask, why would anyone fall for that? But love bombing doesn't feel manipulative. It feels like healing. Many who joined Heaven's Gate came from fractured families or spiritual communities that shamed questioning. In Applewhite's circle, they were told their doubts were signs of growth, not sin. That inversion, doubt as enlightenment, built trust. Only later was that doubt redefined as disloyalty. By then, affection had already fused with belief. Psychologist Alexandra Stein describes this pattern as coercive dependency. It begins with connection, she notes. Once the bond forms, the fear of losing it controls behavior more effectively than threats ever could. The early bliss sets the stage for later obedience. When rules arrive, they're accepted not because of belief in their truth, but because breaking them risks exile from the only people who've ever made you feel complete. We can see echoes of this dynamic in non-cult contexts too. Social media influencers who present exclusive communities of awakening use similar techniques. Excessive validation, personal engagement, emotional storytelling. It's love bombing digitalized, hearts, likes, and comments replicating that first burst of belonging. For spiritual seekers, who often carry the ache of disconnection, the promise of instant kinship feels transcendent. The trap isn't faith, it's dependency disguised as devotion. Inside Heaven's Gate, the love quickly became structured. Members were paired as check partners, responsible for monitoring each other's purity of thought. But during the early phase, the pairings still felt affectionate. A friend, a guide, someone who cared. When those same partners later reported doubts to leadership, it felt like love too, reframed as correction. Emotional safety merged with surveillance. By the second month, recruits learned that to ascend, they needed discipline, ascetic diets, sexual abstinence, coordinated schedules. What kept them compliant wasn't fear, but pride in belonging to the most loving family on earth. That's the paradox of cultic systems. Control presented as care. Even the restrictions were framed as proof of commitment. A former member recalled, "When they told me to cut off contact with my sister, they said it was out of love, to protect my spiritual energy." I believed them. When we study these testimonies, it's tempting to see manipulation as a sinister trick engineered by villains. But in psychological terms, it's the amplification of everyday social processes. Think about workplaces where loyalty is rewarded with praise and dissent with silence, or relationships where affection turns conditional after compliance. The difference between belonging and bondage is often just awareness. And awareness is the first thing love bombing erodes. Dr. Eileen Barker, who spent decades studying new religious movements, explains that many groups don't start intending harm. They genuinely believe they're rescuing humanity, she says. But the structure of devotion can still become exploitative when affection replaces autonomy. In other words, sincerity doesn't prevent manipulation. It just makes it more convincing. For survivors, the hardest part to let go isn't the doctrine. It's the memory of that early love. One woman left Heaven's Gate years before the end but admitted, "For a long time, I missed them. Not the rules, the feeling of being known." That confession captures the human core of the phenomenon. Even after betrayal, the need for belonging endures. Love bombing, at its heart, reveals how influence hijacks intimacy. It demonstrates that control isn't sustained by fear alone, but by affection weaponized through repetition and scarcity. Once we understand that, we can see similar patterns in countless settings: therapy communities, business masterminds, even friend circles that punish independence. Recognizing the pattern doesn't mean rejecting love. It means learning to measure love by freedom, not fervor. So when you hear someone say, "They made me feel special," don't dismiss it as naivety. Understand it as the first stage in a psychological transformation that can happen to anyone. Because in the hands of a manipulative leader, love stops being a bridge between souls and becomes a leash disguised as light. And once you've felt its warmth, walking away from it feels colder than isolation ever did. That's why the next phase always comes quietly. After the high of belonging fades, the rules begin to close in. The hugs grow less frequent, the smiles more conditional, the outside world less relevant. Affection becomes reward, not default. And when the circle tightens, you don't notice immediately. You're too busy trying to earn back the love that once came so easily. Isolation and the narrowing of reality. The shift happens quietly. At first, it's a matter of practicality. Too many distractions, too many skeptics. Then the phones become burdens. The letters home dwindle. The world outside, with all its noise and opinions, starts to feel like static. For Heaven's Gate members, this was framed as purification. Applewhite called it shedding human ties. But from the outside, it looked like disappearance. Isolation isn't just physical confinement, it's perceptual control. Robert J. Lifton described this as milieu control, the management of a person's environment to regulate what they see, hear, and think. Once that filter is in place, perception shrinks. The believer stands in a smaller and smaller reality, one bounded by the group's ideology. From inside, it doesn't feel like restriction. It feels like safety from contamination. In taped testimony, a former member named Sawyer remembered the transition. "At first, we wrote letters to family, short, loving updates. Then Dew said, 'They won't understand. Their energy drags us down.' After that, the mail stopped. It wasn't a command shouted with anger. It was a protective whisper framed as compassion. 'We're keeping your vibration pure.' That's how isolation takes root, slowly, under the guise of care. By 1996, the group had severed nearly all contact with outsiders. Phone calls were replaced with communal check-ins. Each member lived with a companion who echoed beliefs, a mirror reflecting the same thought patterns. Diversity of opinion evaporated. In one recovered correspondence, a follower explained why it felt right. "I used to be confused by all the news and chatter. Now there's peace here. I don't have to question every headline. I already know what's true." That's the paradox of isolation. It relieves anxiety while sowing dependence. Cognitive scientists note that when environmental stimuli narrow, the brain starts recycling internal narratives. Without contrast, ideas loop. Belief becomes experience, not concept. Over time, the self fuses with the group's story. It's no longer ideology, it's identity. Dr. Eileen Barker, a sociologist who studied new religious movements across decades, observed that information confinement doesn't always begin as censorship. It begins as filtering for purity, she wrote. Groups claim to protect members from negativity, misinformation, or spiritual pollution. But every barrier built to keep corruption out also seals reality in. Barker compared these communities to closed ecosystems, self-sustaining but fragile, collapsing when new air enters. In Heaven's Gate, control expanded beyond words. The environment itself became a script. Homes were stripped of mirrors, magazines, and any media connection. Uniform clothing erased individuality. Language shrank. Applewhite's cosmic jargon replaced ordinary expression. Members stopped saying, "I think," and shifted to "the class understands." Linguists call this linguistic convergence, when speech patterns gravitate toward authority, signaling cohesion but eroding independent thought. One videotape recovered after the group's mass suicide showed members dutifully cataloguing possessions. Each item was labeled with the same exact handwriting: neat, neutral, identical. The image captures more than compliance. It shows the absorption of collective rhythm. Former member Rio said it best: You don't need guards when the prison is in your head. Digital communication, ironically, reinforced the bubble. In 1995, Heaven's Gate ran a small web design business. Members used the early internet to earn money, yet remained spiritually sealed off. Applewhite described the online world as a field of human contamination. Useful for outreach, dangerous for influence. They read no news, no outside forums. Every message passed through internal review. The internet for them wasn't connection. It was camouflage, another layer of controlled interface. Psychologists studying coercive systems identify this as information starvation. When leaders monopolize truth, followers experience cognitive undernutrition. The mind stops contrasting alternatives, mistaking deprivation for purity. It's the same technique seen in abusive relationships. The partner isolates, dictates communication, then becomes the sole validator of reality. What begins as guidance turns into dependency. A survivor named Eric once reflected, "The scariest part is, I started feeling proud of not needing anyone. I called it spiritual independence, but really, I was dependent on them for permission to feel separate." That inversion, where separation feels like freedom, is the hallmark of cognitive captivity. It convinces intelligent people they're choosing to stay even as the walls close in. Isolation also amplifies conformity. Social psychologist Solomon Asher's classic experiments showed that when group consensus is unanimous, individuals override their sensory evidence to match it. In a commune cut off from dissenting voices, that pressure intensifies exponentially. When everyone around you believes transcendence requires withdrawal, resistance feels immoral. Doubt becomes betrayal, not of the doctrine, but of the shared peace. Heaven's Gate reinforced peace through routine. The day was divided into schedules: meditation, chores, quiet reflection, all conducted in pairs. Silence wasn't punishment, it was holiness. Members reported calm minds, fewer intrusive thoughts. Neurologically, reduced stimulation can induce mild dissociation, a floating calm mistaken for spiritual progress. Applewhite presented that state as proof of elevation. You're no longer pulled by human frequencies. In truth, sensory deprivation was soft conditioning. Meanwhile, families on the outside received nothing. One mother, whose son joined in 1975 and never returned, said in a BBC interview, "You stop hearing from them and start hearing about them." Her grief became another layer of the group's boundary, proof that outsiders were lost in human emotion. Contact attempts were framed as temptations. In workshops, members rehearsed emotional neutrality when speaking about relatives, a practice Applewhite called detachment drills. Each tier withheld confirmed their loyalty. What nobody outside saw was how doubt still flickered beneath the serenity. A survivor recounted smuggling a letter from his old friend. "I read it behind a dumpster," he said. "My hands shook, not because I feared punishment, but because I didn't know if I still missed her." That's what psychological narrowing does. It erodes emotional memory until longing itself feels foreign. When you can't locate what you miss, leaving stops making sense. Lifton's theory explains why total isolation isn't necessary. It's enough to create relative isolation, where outside voices are reinterpreted through the group's frame. Heaven's Gate did this masterfully. They didn't hide from mainstream science, they redefined it. UFO sightings validated prophecy. Government secrecy confirmed persecution. Every contradiction was inverted into proof. That cognitive loop turned external chaos into internal stability. Today, modern parallels exist in digital echo chambers. Algorithms reward emotional certainty, filtering news and opinions to strengthen pre-existing belief. Spiritual communities online can mutate into similar feedback loops. Likes and comments replacing rituals, influencers assuming prophetic roles. Sociologist Zeynep Tufekci calls this networked isolation. People surrounded by information, yet insulated from dissonance. The pattern mirrors cultic milieu control, differing only in scale and consent. For seekers, the danger lies not in community, but in the loss of friction. Growth requires opposing ideas, control removes them. Within Enlightenment discourse, even mindfulness movements can edge toward insularity when questioning is seen as negativity. The spiritual lexicon of vibration, energy, and alignment can unconsciously mimic Applewhite's purity codes when used to silence dissent. Awareness, not fear, is the antidote. Dr. Barker emphasizes that genuine spiritual systems invite context. Healthy communities expand perception, they don't compress it, she said. When a group defines your reality and filters every challenge through its doctrine, It's no longer teaching. It's replacing your mind with its own. Her words capture the pivot point where faith transforms into control. By the final year, Heaven's Gate's isolation was total. Members lived behind drawn blinds, their only visitors delivery drivers and rented landlords. They trusted in the coming spacecraft that would carry them beyond Earth's corrupted frequencies. On camera, smiles remained serene. But beneath, says one surviving insider, lay exhaustion. The psychic fatigue of maintaining perfection within a sealed world. We thought we were free, he recalled. We just couldn't see that the air we breathed belonged to someone else. Isolation, in psychological terms, is the tightening of perception until every path leads back to the leader. It creates a hall of mirrors where reflection replaces perspective. And yet, this phenomenon isn't confined to cults. Whenever we block challenging voices, label critics as toxic, or curate only affirmations, we participate in miniature versions of the same narrowing. Each of us is capable of building invisible echo chambers around our beliefs. This section of the journey ends where entrapment begins, not with chains, but with quiet. Once silence becomes morality and solitude becomes truth, leaving feels like contamination. The mind, at last, rests within its cage, unaware the door was ever open. Thought reform disguised as revelation. The more the walls of reality closed in, the brighter the revelations seemed to glow. Once the physical world was contained, the battle turned inward, language, thought to motion. The great paradox of Heaven's Gate, and of every high control group, is that reform of mind rarely looks like coercion. It looks like awakening. It feels like epiphany. Applewhite often said the human brain was a corrupted hard drive that needed reformatting. His sermons, half hypnotic lecture, half confessional, wove cosmic imagery with psychological rewiring. Followers repeated terms until meaning blurred. Vessels, exit, next level, the class, human kingdom level below. To outsiders, it read like science fiction. To believers, it was scripture. Each word condensed complex realities into moral binary. Human versus next level, faithful versus fallen, awake versus asleep. Psychologists call this loading the language, a linguistic system that replaces nuance with virtue. Once new words dominate, old ones, like doubt or choice, lose relevance. A former member, known publicly as Sawyer, remembered realizing how his thoughts began arriving already translated. I didn't think, I'm hungry, I thought. My vehicle requires fueling. That distance sounds small, but it rewires empathy. Hunger becomes maintenance. Pain becomes adjustment. Humanity becomes error. Lifton numbered this mechanism among the key pillars of thought reform. Controlling interpretation through sacred vocabulary. Under its logic, even emotions serve doctrine. Fear means the lower self resisting. Joy means alignment. Grief means contamination leaving. The map of meaning turns inward until self and belief merge entirely. In meetings, Applewhite would alternate revelation and correction, a rhythm that psychologists now recognize as reinforcement learning. He'd drop grand insights. You are chosen particles of the next civilization. Then pause, scanning faces for hesitation. If someone frowned, he'd smile and say, see? The human in you doubts, the mind in transition fights truth. Relief followed when the member nodded again, accepting correction. That relief was the hook. The confusion, clarity cycle kept followers dependent on him as interpreter. Every mystery needed his translation, every discomfort his soothing. Gaslighting thrived inside this structure. In everyday life, gaslighting means undermining someone's sense of what's real. In a cult, it becomes theology. Members who questioned were told their doubts proved how close they were to transformation. That disobedience was an illusion projected by corrupted human instincts. Each denial strengthened dependence. Survivor testimonies describe nights spent wrestling with contradictory thoughts, then begging guidance only to be told, if you're confused, you're healing. Confusion itself became evidence of progress, making escape psychologically self-sabotaging. To entertain alternatives felt like backsliding. Researchers studying coercive persuasion note that these cycles mirror trauma bonding. The leader alternates validation and invalidation, producing emotional whiplash that keeps followers unstable but attached. Applewhite's serenity masked the same control pattern seen in narcissistic relationships. Idealization, devaluation, reconciliation. He preached transcendence but modeled dependence. They believed he could decode reality, says Dr. Gilly Jenkinson, a therapist specializing in post-cult recovery. When your world shrinks to one interpreter, autonomy isn't stolen, it dissolves. Language also reshaped time. Applewhite referred to history as the experiment, erasing linear sequence. Past meant error, future meant inevitability. By making the group's narrative the only one with an ending, he trapped them in perpetual now, an eternal lesson preparing for departure. This cognitive compression resembles what psychologists call temporal distortion under hypnosis, where sense of future and past fade, increasing suggestibility. Members didn't plan or reminisce, they prepared. Every day was rehearsal for ascension. Repetition replaced reason. A surviving tape shows Applewhite smiling gently. The next level isn't convinced by pretty words. It watches obedience. His followers nod serene. That sentence fuses metaphysics with behaviorism. Morality equals compliance. If obedience ensures eternal life, disobedience becomes cosmic suicide. Cognitive scientists label this moral absolutism under transcendence framing. When virtue and metaphysical survival unify, logic collapses into obligation. To disobey isn't just wrong, it's unthinkable. Meanwhile, internal group discussions mimicked academic seminars. Members debated fine details of vessel maintenance, or vibration calibration, giving illusion of intellectual engagement. But boundaries of debate were fixed. Dr. Janja Lalick calls this bounded dissent, controlled disagreement that strengthens the core ideology by practicing containment. They let you question anything except the premise, she explained. That technique grants satisfaction of inquiry without risk of change. Survivor Gail described feeling smarter, not smaller, the deeper she studied. We wrote essays about lifting off frequencies, she said. It wasn't madness, it was rigorous. Only later did she see how every answer looped back to Applewhite. Like a puzzle that always solved to the same pattern, thought collapsed into repetition. Critics sometimes ask why no one simply noticed. But when reinforcement equals revelation, noticing feels like betrayal. Applewhite's sermons often began with his soft Texas drawl recounting his own doubts. Sometimes I wonder too, he'd say, eyes moist. But do reminds me, the next level tests resolve through illusion. By modeling vulnerability, then resolving it with doctrine, he affirmed both relatability and authority. The technique, familiar to communication psychologists, is emotional mirroring. Leaders disclose just enough to appear genuine, then redirect emotion toward ideology. Followers interpret this as spiritual intimacy, deepening trust. The more he doubted publicly, the more they believed privately. Every aspect of daily life reflected this cognitive loop. Members replaced spontaneous speech with formatted check-ins. I acknowledge the next level's lesson today. Corrections came wrapped in tenderness. Your tone contained human vibration. The goal wasn't punishment, but purification. Yet living under constant linguistic scrutiny induced what trauma therapists term hypervigilant compliance, a state where internal monitoring replaces external coercion. No guard needed when your mind becomes self-policing. Sawyer recalled waking from dreams and confessing them by breakfast, fearing stray human thoughts. Thought reform didn't crush curiosity overnight. It made curiosity feel unsafe. During the final year, Applewhite introduced what he called exit preparation tapes. Each member recorded messages affirming readiness. Psychologists analyzing these videos describe a uniform cadence, flat intonation, mild euphoria consistent with dissociation. They spoke of shedding the vehicle with gratitude. Words no longer described reality, they replaced it. This linguistic detachment parallels what clinicians observe in trauma victims whose perception narrows for safety. In cults, that disassociation is artificially induced, safety through surrender. Gaslighting extended even to observable contradictions. When Applewhite's health failed, he framed illness as proof of transition. When prophecies missed deadlines, he declared time irrelevant. Such reversals mirrored the classic moving goalpost technique in abusive dynamics, altering standards to maintain authority. Each failed prediction deepened faith, not doubt. Psychologist Margaret Singer wrote that this paradox thrives because members attribute discrepancy to their own misunderstanding rather than leaders' fault. A learned self-blame. Inside Heaven's Gate, confession became communion. Members shared private thoughts in cleansing circles. Supporters viewed these as spiritual honesty. In fact, they normalized surveillance. Once inner dialogue belongs to the group, isolation completes. Lifton's framework calls it confession that reinforces ideology, the ninth criterion of thought reform. It's not truth-telling. It's conditioning emotional transparency toward one direction only. Guilt and gratitude blur until punishment feels cleansing. One ex-member summarized, "We stopped asking what was true and started asking what would please him." That shift from epistemic to relational motivation defines totalistic systems. Belief loses intellectual content and becomes emotional loyalty. By the last months, Heaven's Gate no longer functioned as a search for truth, but as a choreography of obedience. Each question answered in advance, each answer sanctified by shared relief. What makes this mechanism universal is its resonance with ordinary spiritual life. Many seekers experience moments when revelations rewrite understanding, when surrender feels holy. In healthy contexts, reinterpretation coexists with critical thought and external reference. In high-control settings, it replaces them. The line between guidance and gaslighting isn't brightness of vision, but permission to verify it yourself. When someone claims your enlightenment depends on silencing inner contradiction, you're in psychological exchange, not transcendence. For spiritual communities today, this insight matters. Discipleship, mentorship, even therapy can echo cultic structures when authority interprets experience rather than facilitates it. The red flag isn't intensity, it's monopolization of meaning. Ask, can you disagree and still belong? Is confusion welcomed as part of growth or rebranded as weakness? Those answers reveal whether revelation transforms or reforms thought. Dr. Jenkinson advises survivors rebuilding self-trust to reintroduce ambiguity intentionally, reading conflicting ideas, restoring messy nuance. Healing isn't reclaiming certainty, she says. It's reclaiming confusion as your own. That's the antidote to thought reform disguised as revelation, embracing paradox without surrendering the power to evaluate it. In the final, recovered notebook from Heaven's Gate, a line reads, "Doubt is the final enemy of graduation." The handwriting is calm, careful. Yet beneath that sentence lies the buried truth, that doubt was the last voice of selfhood. Spiritual systems that demonize doubt don't transcend humanity, they erase it. When questioning becomes heresy, revelation becomes control disguised as light. And somewhere in that California mansion, as cameras later recorded their farewell messages, each face carried that serene glow, the illumination of minds utterly certain they were free. But freedom, when defined by another's vocabulary, is only a word. The narcissistic leader archetype. Marshall Applewhite's eyes had a strange quality, tender yet unreachable. In recordings, he blinked slowly, smiled softly, and spoke as if confiding a sacred secret. "You're not of this world," he'd whisper. "You're special." That tone, gentle, personal, godlike, was the sound of control. Psychologists later analyzing his mannerisms described what they called the narcissistic trance. Charisma mixed with fragility, magnetism fused with self-delusion. It's the emotional signature of a leader who believes his reflection is revelation. To understand the psychology of a cult, you have to start with him, the person at its center, the gravity while pulling everything inward. Research on destructive movements consistently highlights one pattern. The leader exhibits traits drawn from the cluster B spectrum, narcissistic, antisocial, sometimes histrionic. Dr. Paul Martin, a clinical psychologist who interviewed dozens of survivors, described these figures as fragile gods. They demand devotion not because they're strong, but because their self-worth collapses without an audience. They oscillate between grandiosity and paranoia, generosity and rage, divinity and despair. Applewhite fit the pattern precisely. His story began in crisis. In the early 197s, after losing his job as a university music teacher, he suffered what friends described as a psychological breakdown. He met Bonnie Nettles, a nurse fascinated by mysticism, and she became both partner and prophet. Together, they built a cosmology where his pain became destiny. Rejection reframed as persecution, failure as proof of divine election. Narcissistic Reconstruction theorists call this the Messianic defense, when humiliation is alchemized into higher purpose. The world that once shamed him would now kneel in awe. Dr. Alexander Lowen, who studied narcissism long before it became pop psychology, explained that such leaders do not love the group. They love what the group allows them to feel about themselves. A cult isn't built for its members' growth. It's an external mirror for one person's internal fracture. Applewhite's so-called next level wasn't a theology. It was his healing myth, played out through hundreds of disciples who reflected his delusion back to him until it became truth. Charisma, in sociological terms, is emotional legitimacy born of intensity. Max Weber called it charismatic authority, the belief that a leader's power flows from extraordinary qualities. But modern psychology reframes it. Charisma is performative empathy, an ability to echo others' emotions so dramatically that followers experience resonance as revelation. Applewhite studied that rhythm instinctively. His voice rose in crescendos of ecstasy, fell into whispers of reassurance. Each pause felt intimate. He made spiritual hypnosis look like conversation. Survivors recall leaving meetings weeping, convinced they'd glimpsed an enlightened soul. That was charisma operating as trance induction. Within months, admiration blurred into worship. Followers found themselves quoting him unconsciously. Small quirks, his cadence, his phrasing, even his head tilt, spread like mannerisms in a family. Psychological mimicry signaled cohesion, but it also meant self-displacement. In high-demand groups, mirroring the leader equals belonging, deviation equals betrayal. Each imitation confirmed his divinity, feeding the circular economy of narcissism. Adoration in exchange for identity. Dr. Janja Lalick identifies this loop as charismatic exploitation. The leader supplies meaning, the follower supplies reflection. In her studies, these systems create something akin to collective narcissism, a group-level inflation mirroring the leader's ego. Heaven's Gate members weren't merely serving Applewhite. They became extensions of him, fragments completing his cosmological portrait. "We are Du's mind in different bodies," one wrote. That sentence reveals how narcissistic charisma colonizes individuality under the language of unity. Behind the benevolence sat cold strategy. When Applewhite faced dissent, he used what experts now label empathic manipulation, offering comfort that conceals coercion. Instead of punishing doubters outright, he'd express disappointment, framing their hesitation as pain he personally felt. "When you pull away, it pulls my vibration down," he'd say softly. The appeal to empathy weaponized compassion, making obedience feel protective. Followers internalized his moods like weather, craving his approval, fearing his despair. "We wanted to keep him happy," one survivor admitted. "When he smiled, it felt like the universe smiled." Narcissists in power often employ what clinicians term reality distortion fields, charismatic narratives so emotionally charged they override reason. Applewhite's field fused two potent currents, transcendence and redemption. Unlike political demagogues who promise wealth or vengeance, he offered purification. Followers weren't just joining a group, they were curing existence. That moral grandeur seduces the intellect because it cloaks domination in idealism. Narcissistic leaders rarely say, "Serve me." They say, "Serve truth, and I embody it." Yet beneath the cosmic poise lay constant insecurity. Applewhite adjusted doctrine whenever challenged, redefining setbacks as divine tests. When Nettles died, he couldn't accept her absence as contradiction. Instead, he proclaimed she had graduated early. The group mourned, then celebrated. This reframing illustrates what Dr. Robert Lifton called ideological totalism. Reality bent to preserve the leader's infallibility. Each modification strengthened, not weakened, authority. Proof of connection to forces beyond comprehension. Survivors later realized that their grief had been reinterpreted as faith reinforcement. "He taught us that pain meant progress," one said. "We believed it." Research on leadership pathology shows that narcissistic figures maintain loyalty by alternating omnipotence and vulnerability. They confess insecurities to appear authentic, only to reclaim superiority through redemption narratives. Applewhite frequently shared his fears of failing the next level, evoking collective guilt that reversed into collective protection. Members promised to purify themselves, so he wouldn't suffer. Through compassion inversion, he became emotionally untouchable. Caring for him replaced caring for self. Dr. Sam Vaknin, an early scholar of malignant narcissism, describes this mechanism as shared psychosis, when followers adopt the leader's delusional framework to sustain relational attachment. In such systems, belief isn't indoctrination, it's empathy misapplied. Loving him meant believing him. The deeper the identification, the harder it became to perceive abuse. Applewhite's control thrived not on cruelty, but on emotional intimacy that blurred into possession. A telling moment occurred during a taped meeting weeks before the end. Applewhite addressed his followers as "my children," then immediately corrected himself. "No, my partner's in transition." The slip reveals the dual nature of narcissistic authority. Parental protection, hiding hierarchical dominance. He needed to be loved yet worshipped, close yet untouchable. This psychological oscillation kept followers oscillating too, between adoration and anxiety. Their emotional regulation synced to his moods, a process neuroscientists call limbic contagion. His peace became their peace, his tension their apocalypse. Not all charisma destroys, of course. Many spiritual teachers radiate confidence without coercion. The difference lies in feedback. Healthy charisma tolerates reflection. Pathological charisma demands echo. Applewhite's system allowed only one mirror, his own. When followers offered independent insight, he absorbed it into doctrine, erasing the origin. "Good point," he'd say. "The next level just spoke through you." Agency vanished in flattery. That linguistic theft, praise disguised as erasure, is common among narcissistic authorities from cults to corporations. It consolidates creative energy into a single ego while convincing contributors they've been honored. By understanding this dynamic, we uncover the crossroads between leadership and manipulation in any context. Dr. Eileen Barker notes that structures around charismatic figures determine outcome. Accountability equals mentorship. Isolation equals cult. Heaven's Gate lacked counterweight. No elders, no transparent process, no dissenting voices. Applewhite's fragile self became the axis of a spiritual enterprise, and when that self crumbled, so did everyone tethered to it. Modern psychology extends this lesson beyond religious extremes. In relationships, workplaces, even online followings, narcissistic leaders replicate the same emotional economy. Grand vision exchanged for devotion, criticism reframed as betrayal. The warning isn't against charisma itself, but blindness to reciprocity. Power becomes toxic when admiration flows only one way. By the mid-199s, Applewhite's reflection loop was complete. He spoke not as man, but as conduit. Followers gazed not at him, but through him. "Do as the lens of the next level," one wrote. In reality, they were staring at his deforming ego amplified by their faith. When the final prophecy came, the comet, the departure, it wasn't a new revelation but the inevitable endpoint of narcissistic escalation. The grand gesture to prove perfection unbreakable. Martyrdom became mirror polish for self-importance. Narcissism, in its extreme, seeks annihilation of conflict. The leader builds a world so centered around himself that any fracture feels deadly. For Applewhite, physical death was preferable to psychological disintegration. His suicide was, paradoxically, an act of control, ending the story before doubt could rewrite it. Survivors watching those tapes later realized they'd witnessed the consummation of a narcissistic myth, a man destroying evidence of his imperfection by erasing himself and everyone who reflected it. When we recognize this archetype, we see echoes everywhere, from political movements to motivational industries. The signs repeat: seduction through vision, validation through exclusivity, exploitation through care. Awareness isn't cynicism, it's protection. True spiritual leadership expands selfhood. Narcissistic leadership consumes it. In every era, seekers gather around those who promise transcendence. The lesson of Heaven's Gate isn't to fear devotion. It's to notice when admiration replaces discernment. Because behind the softest voice and the brightest halo, a narcissistic leader doesn't guide you toward light. He teaches you to orbit his own, breaking the self. Inside the walls of that California mansion, sameness became sacred. Matching haircuts, identical clothing, synchronized movements. Each detail erased another trace of individuality. The act of renouncing the human was framed as purification, but psychologically, it was decomposition. Survivors later realized they were undergoing what therapists call identity collapse, the systematic dismantling of personal boundaries until self-recognition fades. This wasn't about belief anymore. It was about becoming an instrument that could no longer distinguish its thoughts from its orders. The group called their clothes uniforms of clarity. Applewhite explained that blending appearance removed distraction from spiritual growth. Beneath the rhetoric, sociologists saw a technique used in totalistic systems from monasteries to military barracks. Depersonalization through conformity. When individuality disappears, dissent has nowhere to live. Each mirror in the house reflected the same face of obedience, and every I slowly became we. Sleep and rhythm reinforced the submission. Members followed rigid daily cycles. Lights out, quiet meditation assigned tasks. Dr. Alexandra Stein, who studies coercive control, describes this as entrainment, syncing biological rhythms to an external command. Over time, such synchronization blurs where the leader's will ends and the follower's begins. You stop hearing your inner voice, one survivor said. You just anticipate his next instruction. Even fatigue became doctrine. Lack of sleep was proof that human weakness was fading. Psychologists comparing diaries from various cults note the same pattern. At first, rules feel clarifying, later, they replace thought. Heavensgate manuals prescribed every gesture: how to fold towels, how to brush teeth, how to speak without vibrational leakage. Each rule looked trivial alone, but together formed a lattice around the psyche. Cognitive scientists call this microregulation, small, consistent constraints that restructure cognition through repetition. It's obedience conditioning disguised as discipline. Gail, who left months before the end, said her breaking point came when she caught herself rehearsing feelings. "I'd start to cry," she recalled, then stop and think. Would Do approve of this emotion? Even sadness needed permission. The moment she noticed that filter, she realized she no longer knew what genuine felt like. In that realization lies the border between faith and captivity, when authenticity requires authorization. Fear replaced warmth gradually. Where love bombing once dominated, correction took its place. Compliments became evaluations. Closeness became surveillance. Each member served as watcher over another, ensuring purity of conduct. Behavioral psychologists identify this as distributed enforcement, where peer observation sustains compliance longer than overt punishment. "My partner wasn't my guard," said one ex-member. "She was my conscience." That statement captures the genius of control through intimacy. Loyalty weaponized as moral duty. Applewhite framed slipping thoughts as interference from the human kingdom. Members confessed dreams or doubts during nightly circles. At first, confessions fostered solidarity. Later, they produced shame. Every deviation, no matter how small, drew solemn reminders of the stakes. Lose discipline, and you risk remaining behind when the craft arrives. That cosmic consequence turned obedience into existential survival. Within that logic, even self-erasure felt heroic. Dr. Robert J. Lifton's term cognitive dissonance describes the stress of holding contradictory beliefs. In cults, that tension is resolved not by adjusting doctrine, but by adjusting identity. When a member senses conflict, love for family versus devotion to leader, the easiest relief is to suppress the self that disagrees. Over time, suppression becomes automatic, a psychological reflex. That's why leaving later feels impossible. The self capable of leaving no longer exists. As control tightened, language drifted further from ordinary meaning. Members addressed one another as it to minimize attachment to gender. Words like I, mine, and want disappeared. Linguist Susan Harding called this grammatical purification, a cognitive technique that replaces autonomy with role play. By stripping pronouns, Applewhite stripped agency. If there's no I, there's no rebellion. The English language, once a tool of expression, became another uniform. Ritual replaced reflection. Members rotated chores, consumed precisely measured meals, and maintained near-military posture during teachings. Each act reinforced unity, but simultaneously fractured personal agency. One survivor compared it to living as a single cell in a gigantic organism. From the outside it seemed robotic, from the inside it felt peaceful. That peace, therapists warn, is dissociative calm, a numbing that mimics enlightenment when emotion shuts down from stress and submission. As doubts flickered, Applewhite reframed them as demons of the lower self. He quoted followers' private questions publicly, transforming vulnerability into spectacle. This tactic mirrors public humiliation therapy documented in other cults. Group correction presented as love. "We loved him more after he scolded us," said former member Eric. Punishment meant he still cared. Such inversion of affection anchors trauma bonds. Fear intertwined with devotion until pain feels like proof of loyalty. Modern neuroscience explains why conditioning this deep endures. Continuous compliance produces predictable dopaminergic feedback. Each successful act of obedience releases relief, reinforcing behavior. Brain imaging studies of obedience experiments, from Milgram onward, showed decreased activation in regions linked to agency when authority assumes responsibility. The follower's brain literally offloads moral judgment. In cults, this neurological outsourcing becomes spiritual doctrine. The leader decides, the follower obeys, peace follows. Yet fragments of self sometimes resist. One woman recalled sneaking glances at her reflection during chores. "I'd look fast, like stealing," she said, "just to see if I was still in there." Those quick gazes were acts of rebellion, the psyche's faint attempts to verify existence. Applewhite preached that the human body was just a container. But secretly, members inked initials on personal items, microsignatures of identity reborn in exile. Even under total conformity, individuality doesn't die. It hides. As the final months approached, that hidden defiance eroded under exhaustion and spiritual inflation. Applewhite announced that remaining traces of humanness must be purified through exit practice. Members rehearsed death verbally, describing it as graduation. Each rehearsal dulled fear, while strengthening phobia of failure. Psychiatrists later recognized these rituals as exposure training inverted. Desensitization not to anxiety, but to mortality. Serenity replaced survival instinct. By then, leaving wasn't merely dangerous, it was inconceivable. The group's rulebook redefined departure as separation from the next level, tantamount to obliteration. Psychologists classify this as existential entrapment, typical in coercive systems where selfhood equals membership. If salvation and identity are the same, questioning feels suicidal. Survivors say the body might have left, but the mind lingered for years, haunted by reflexive guilt for betraying paradise. Dr. Gilly Jenkinson, who treats post-cult trauma, explains this paradox. Freedom begins as terror because the nervous system associates obedience with safety. The pathway out demands rekindling the very individuality once condemned. That's why therapy focuses on rebuilding tolerance for choice, asking ex-members to make trivial decisions like picking a meal or outfit without seeking guidance. To outsiders, such exercises seem small. To survivors, they reopen neural circuits for autonomy. Within Heaven's Gate, the transition from affection to fear marked the completion of the system. Love had recruited them, discipline retained them, guilt sealed them. Every mechanism pointed inward, mining devotion until personal identity broke under spiritual gravity. The process mirrored what trauma psychologists call collapse of self versus system. The tipping point when inner and outer voices merge so completely that obedience feels self-generated. By 1997, every member moved through the mansion like synchronized shadows. Their conversations echoed scripted serenity. No disagreements, no laughter out of place. The final videotapes showed tranquil faces articulating a single truth. They were ready. But behind that calm lay the culmination of years of conditioning. Each smile, each rehearsed assurance, was evidence of a mind dismantled and rebuilt to fit another's dream. Breaking the self isn't destruction in their eyes, it's completion. Applewhite told them, the human must die for the divine to be born. They believed him, because by then the human had already disappeared. What remained was faith shaped into function, an empty vessel polished to mirror its creator. The tragedy isn't that they lost themselves in one night. It's that they surrendered piece by piece until disappearance felt like deliverance. The price of leaving. When the illusion shatters, the world doesn't return to color. It stays gray for a while. Survivors often say leaving isn't an act of bravery. It's an act of collapse. One moment you're a chosen soul, and the next you're just a person standing outside with nothing but silence. For those who escaped Heaven's Gate before the final departure, that silence was louder than any sermon. Sawyer described it as falling back into gravity. The beliefs that once lifted him up now pinned him down with guilt. Leaving wasn't liberation, it was exile from certainty. Psychologists who study post-cult trauma call this state identity void. Everything that defined you, language, community, morality, vanished. The nervous system, trained to equate obedience with safety, reads autonomy as danger. Dr. Gilly Jenkinson, who counsels survivors, explains that freedom feels like free fall. They've lost not only the group but the internal map that told them how to be. That's why the first months after exit rarely feel triumphant. They feel haunted. Gail remembered sitting in a diner days after running away. I hadn't ordered food in years without someone approving it, she said. The waitress asked me how I wanted my eggs, and I started crying. Every choice reopened a wound. Therapy records show similar accounts. People spending minutes frozen in front of grocery shelves, unable to pick soap or cereal. The smallest decisions confront them with the realization that preference itself must be relearned. What seems mundane to outsiders is, for them, existential. Then comes the grief. Survivors grieve not only the lost years, but the people who didn't make it out. Many still speak of those who stayed behind in reverent tones, a mix of sorrow and envy. They got the ending I once wanted, one said softly. Guilt entangles with longing, trauma with nostalgia. Dr. Alexandra Stein calls this cognitive dissonance collapse. The brain trying to reconcile affection for individuals with disgust for the system that consumed them. Healing starts when both can coexist without erasing each other. Families face their own fractures. Parents who tried for years to rescue children often greet them with joy laced with rage. Why didn't you see? Survivors interpret that anger as rejection. Communication falters because language itself no longer matches. Therapists report a phenomenon they term parallel trauma. Relatives traumatized by absence and survivors traumatized by return. Each expects closure. Neither receives it immediately. Dr. Eileen Barker notes that rebuilding trust takes years of cautious conversation, like learning to speak across dimensions that no longer overlap. Post-cult families confront strange boundaries. Survivors crave safety but fear intrusion. Loved ones crave closeness but fear triggering collapse. Many find that shared meals or silence work better than interrogation. Over time, humor re-enters, often dark, sometimes absurd. Sawyer remembered laughing uncontrollably with his sister when he couldn't operate a microwave. It beeped twice, and I flinched like the leader was calling. In that laughter, the nervous system begins to release its vigilance. Healing hides in ordinary absurdities. Psychologically, leaving dismantles the binary worldview that once organized everything. Pure or impure, ascending or falling. Dr. Robert Lifton described this as the return of ideological pluralism, reclaiming the ability to tolerate uncertainty. But tolerance feels painful at first. The rush of belonging is replaced by ambiguity. Many ex-members drift toward new belief systems, sometimes repeating old patterns under different labels. It's why support groups emphasize discernment, not conversion. Replacing one truth with another is the quickest way back to dependency, warns Dr. Jenkinson. Clinicians working with former cult members observe symptoms paralleling complex PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, emotional numbing. Ordinary environments trigger old scripts. The scent of incense, a sonorous voice, a choir melody, all can reactivate the body's memory of surrender. One client described attending a yoga class and freezing when the instructor softly said, "Let go." Letting go once meant annihilation. Now it had to mean trust. Recovery requires rewriting meaning itself. Support networks serve as lifelines. Peer gatherings allow laughter at shared absurdities and confession without judgment. The movement, I Got Out, has created spaces where survivors post stories publicly, defying shame through visibility. Reading those accounts reveals a strange paradox. They speak of pain with intellectual precision, as if mapping trauma grants agency. It does. Naming becomes exorcism. Clinical studies show that narrative reconstruction, a process of retelling one's story chronologically, with emotional insight rather than doctrine, reduces symptoms of dissociation and helps rebuild coherent identity. When survivors reclaim authorship, they reclaim selfhood. Still, the longing lingers. Many miss the feeling of alignment, the instant clarity, the love. Neuroscience explains it as withdrawal. The brain once flooded with dopamine and oxytocin now operates on scarcity. The world outside feels emotionally flat. Therapists compare this to grief detox after a toxic relationship. They grieve the fantasy of perfection, says Jenkinson. The drug was certainty. Healing demands learning that meaning can coexist with doubt. Families also navigate their own learning curve. Research on post-cult family therapy suggests gradual reattachment works best. Instead of probing doctrine, relatives focus on shared memories beyond the cult's reach. Childhood jokes, favorite songs, pets. Simple anchors rebuild neural pathways of safety. When survivors laugh genuinely, the brain relearns that joy isn't betrayal. That's the invisible milestone. The first spontaneous emotion, unfiltered by doctrine. Gail described one afternoon when she laughed at a grocery store mishap and realized she hadn't monitored the sound of her voice. For 5 seconds, she said, I stopped thinking about how to sound human. I just was. Society, meanwhile, tends to sensationalize survivors, framing them as gullible or broken. This stigma compounds trauma. Dr. Margaret Singer cautioned decades ago that leaving a cult should be seen less as foolishness and more as recovery from coercion. She compared it to surviving emotional captivity. Insight arrives slowly, shame hinders dangerously. Public empathy can accelerate reintegration. Judgment can reverse it. Every journalist retelling the story influences whether survivors hide or heal. The process of rebuilding faith, in any form, is delicate. Some abandon spirituality entirely, fearing repetition. Others rediscover it through self-guided exploration. Healthy communities encourage accountability instead of obedience. Stein summarizes it as the shift from attachment to autonomy. The task isn't rejecting belonging, it's choosing it freely. Former members who succeed often maintain circles where disagreement is welcomed. For them, Safety equals conversation, not consensus. Financial and occupational recovery also test endurance. Many left behind years of professional growth. Relearning practical skills becomes symbolic rehabilitation. One man, an ex-heavensgate web designer, joined an IT firm decades later. He described his first paycheck as the first proof I existed again. Work reattaches identity to tangible outcomes. Purpose divorced from doctrine becomes medicine. Yet the shadows of the past persist. Nightmares of reunion appear years later. Dreams where the leader smiles and says, "You've returned." The body tenses before consciousness intervenes. Trauma researchers call this reinstatement fear memory, the neural residue of conditioned dependence. Long-term therapy focuses on converting these intrusions into reminders of survival, rewiring fear into pride. Over time, memories stop feeling like vortexes pulling backward and become landmarks on a map of endurance. Families play crucial roles in this transformation. Those who listen rather than lecture help survivors differentiate love from control. Sawyer once said the hardest thing his sister ever did for him was nothing, just sitting beside him while he stared at a blank wall. "She didn't ask what I believed now," he said. "She waited until I could believe again." That patience embodies what therapists call earned trust, a relational counterpart to self-trust. Healing unfolds in silence shared, not slogans offered. As months turn to years, some survivors transform their pain into advocacy, writing, counseling, creating art. They don't erase the past, they metabolize it. Through teaching others how manipulation operates, they reclaim mastery. Studies show that meaning-making accelerates recovery. The mind that once surrendered to total systems now constructs complexity intentionally. What was once submission becomes discernment. But not everyone reaches that stage. Some linger in half-worlds, part believer, part critic, haunted by nostalgia for transcendence. Dr. Barker refers to this as the in-between time, neither inside nor fully outside. In that liminal space, former members must craft new myths grounded in humanity rather than salvation. The heroes of these new stories aren't prophets or martyrs, but ordinary people choosing ambiguity over absolutes. That's the quiet revolution after exit. Redefining spirituality, not as escape from humanity, but reconnection with it. Ultimately, the price of leaving isn't just lost years. It's the dismantling of a dream built from the best parts of human longing. Survivors pay with innocence, but they gain awareness. As Jenkinson reminds her clients, cults take your trust in others. Recovery gives back your trust in perception. When that trust returns, the grey world slowly regains colour. Not the blinding white of certainty, but a spectrum, wide enough to include contradiction. And in that spectrum, the possibility of genuine freedom finally appears. Rebuilding the mind. Recovery begins where belief once ended, in the quiet space after collapse. For survivors of Heaven's Gate and countless movements like it, the first step isn't enlightenment. It's remembering how to inhabit their own thoughts again. Dr. Gilly Jenkinson, who counsels former members, describes this stage as learning to think in first person. Pronouns, choice, even curiosity must be relearned piece by piece. Your mind was structured like a cathedral to someone else's truth, she says. Rebuilding means taking down the stained glass without destroying the light. Trauma-informed therapy anchors that rebuilding process. Practitioners focus first on grounding. The body must relearn safety before the mind risks memory. Survivors practice simple exercises. Feeling feet on the floor, noticing breath, naming colors in the room. These acts sound trivial, yet they re-establish ownership of perception. Cult life conditioned them to view sensations as signals from a higher plane. Grounding reclaims them as human. When you can describe the room you're in without translating it into doctrine, explains Jenkinson, you're back in the world. From there comes psychoeducation, understanding how manipulation reshaped cognition. Therapists guide clients through diagrams of coercive control, mapping tactics like love bombing and isolation to specific psychological responses. Seeing those patterns on paper breaks the myth of unique failure. They realize it wasn't stupidity, says psychologist Alexandra Stein. It was conditioning, and conditioning can be undone. Knowledge turns shame into comprehension, one of the most powerful antidotes to indoctrination. Peer support amplifies that shift. In survivor circles, laughter often precedes tears. The absurdity of old rituals becomes both horror and relief. One former member recalled imitating Applewhite's phrases during a group meeting, human kingdom level below, until everyone dissolved into hysterics. For the first time, it was funny, she said. Humor reframes fear as distance. Neurologically, shared laughter releases oxytocin, countering isolation and re-establishing social trust. Slowly, belonging disconnects from control. Reintegration, however, isn't linear. Many describe sudden surges of faith or guilt, what trauma specialists call flashback cognition, momentary returns to the group's mental architecture. A smell, a song, a phrase can reopen the trance. Therapists teach ground and name, labeling the memory without surrendering to it. That's a thought from then, not a truth from now. Each repetition weakens the old neural path, strengthening the new one. Awareness as neurological remodeling. Narrative reconstruction provides the framework for meaning. Survivors write their life stories from before, during, and after the cult, weaving emotion with event to create continuity. The task isn't to explain why they believed, but to show how each stage answered a human need. You can't just delete a worldview, says Jenkinson. You have to replace it with a narrative big enough to hold the pain. Writing allows survivors to become authors rather than characters of their experience. The shift from passive to active language. I was told to I chose, we believed to I thought, signals reclaimed agency. For Gail, who wants to find herself as a vessel preparing for the next level, the breakthrough came when she wrote a letter to her younger self. I thanked her for wanting truth, she said. The problem wasn't her hunger, it was who fed her. That distinction, honoring the motive, rejecting the manipulation, mirrors a core principle of recovery psychology, integrating the shadow without self-condemnation. Survivors must separate genuine spirituality from indoctrinated fear, allowing curiosity to coexist with caution. Therapists encourage gradual exposure to spiritual language divorced from doctrine. A meditation song might replace cult chants. Nature walks might substitute for communal rituals. The goal is to reconnect transcendence with autonomy. We don't tell them to stop believing, notes Stein. We help them believe differently, without surrendering discernment. Restoring symbolic thinking, metaphor rather than dogma, returns flexibility to the psyche once locked in absolutes. Peer-run retreats like I Got Out meetings extend this process beyond therapy. Survivors cook, share art, sometimes sit in silence together. They rebuild community minus hierarchy. In one session, participants wrote the words they'd been forbidden to say, doubt, desire, I know, on paper slips and burned them. The ritual wasn't mystical. It was neurological rehearsal for freedom. Fire as memory, choice as ceremony. These small freedoms accumulate. A survivor named Eric described the first time he bought clothes without prescribed colors. I stood in front of the mirror wearing red and felt panic, he admitted. Then relief, no one appeared. That absence became presence. His reflection was finally his own. Such mundane victories signify the rewiring of emotional logic. Fear no longer predicts punishment. Each independent act trains the brain to interpret autonomy as safety rather than threat. As stability forms, survivors confront a deeper question. What now defines meaning? Existential therapy addresses the void left by dissolved certainty. Counselors guide clients to identify values based on lived experience rather than revelation. One exercise lists things worth trusting. Early attempts produce short lists: breath, gravity, coffee. Weeks later, the lists expand: friendship, humor, music, curiosity. Meaning rises from participation, not prophecy. Family involvement becomes crucial once the survivor's new autonomy reaches gentleness, not defense. Loved ones learn to offer listening without fixing. Dr. Eileen Barker advises relatives to ask open questions instead of moral ones. What does peace look like for you today? Such language avoids triggering binary thinking embedded by cult training. Dialogue becomes therapy shared, conversation restoring elasticity where rigidity once ruled. Clinically, the nervous system lags behind cognitive insight. Even years later, sudden praise can quicken the heartbeat. Echoes of love bombing. Therapists teach somatic discernment, distinguishing genuine connection from manipulative intensity by how the body feels afterward. A healthy bond leaves warmth and curiosity. An unhealthy one leaves depletion and urgency. This embodied literacy becomes the new shield against future coercion. Public storytelling marks the outer edge of healing. Interviews, podcasts, or documentaries give survivors both exposure and closure. Speaking aloud what was once secret realigns memory networks. Each retelling shifts focus from leader to survivor, from myth to meaning. Sociologists studying these narratives find consistent language evolution. Guilt verbs fade, agency verbs grow. They go from, "I was broken" to "I'm rebuilding," says Barker. Its syntax is recovery. Self-trust, the final milestone, seldom arrives with grand revelation. It creeps in through ordinary days, a morning coffee unshared, a decision unverified, a sunset appreciated without turning it into sign. Gail remembers the first time she laughed freely. "Someone told a terrible joke," she said. "I laughed before checking if it was appropriate. The sound surprised me. That's when I knew I had a self again." For many spiritual seekers watching these journeys, discomfort arises. If such intelligent, earnest people could surrender reason, what stops the rest of us? The answer, therapists suggest, isn't fear but mindfulness of influence. Awareness doesn't destroy spirituality, it purifies it. Recognizing susceptibility becomes the foundation of genuine faith, the kind that withstands charisma and mystery alike. Dr. Jenkinson often ends sessions with a simple phrase: "Confusion is safe now." In that permission lies freedom. Because rebuilding the mind isn't returning to who you were before the cult. It's growing into someone who can coexist with uncertainty. For survivors of coercive spirituality, that uncertainty is sacred territory, the proof that thought, once colonized, now belongs to them. The mirror we don't want to see. The story of Heaven's Gate might seem like a relic, a bizarre footnote from the late 20th century, but the psychology behind it never vanished. It only adapted. Today, the same mechanisms that once bound a few dozen seekers in a California mansion echo across screens, offices, and relationships. The mirror we don't want to see is that cultic influence isn't reserved for the extremes. It's woven through ordinary life, wherever belonging outweighs autonomy. To understand this reflection, we have to widen the frame beyond the tragic and look straight at the familiar. Consider the workplace starved of dissent, where loyalty is rewarded with inclusion and questioning labeled as negativity. The language is corporate, not cosmic, but the logic is identical. Group narratives promise salvation through productivity. Leaders frame long hours as noble sacrifice. The result is obedience born of fear wrapped in purpose. Psychologists classify this as coercive alignment. Conformity achieved through emotional stakes rather than overt threat. Employees echo slogans, suppress doubts, and gradually fuse identity with performance metrics. Control travels downward, disguised as team spirit. Online spaces magnify these dynamics. Algorithms curate digital communes where affirmation replaces dialogue. Spiritual influencers speak of vibrations, energetic alignment, or high-frequency tribes, creating digital temples organized around virtue through wellness. Followers share mantras and defense mechanisms identical to cult scripts. You're just not ready to understand. Negativity lowers frequency. Anyone questioning the group's leader or narrative is exiled for low energy. Sociologist Zeynep Tufekci calls this soft totalism of networks. Social systems enforcing homogeneity through emotional language instead of ideology. A former Heaven's Gate member once said, "We didn't think we were following a person, we thought we were following clarity." That admission points to the modern paradox. Influence thrives when it wears the mask of self-improvement. In a culture obsessed with optimization, surrender arrives disguised as progress. Life coaches promise quantum upgrades of consciousness. Workplaces sell family culture. The rhetoric changes, the dependency remains. When autonomy feels heavy and belonging feels light, the gravitational pull toward authority begins. Dr. Janja Lalick warns that human psychology gravitates to certainty in proportion to anxiety. When the world destabilizes, she notes, the mind rewards anything that simplifies. Cults succeed because they weaponize simplicity. Good versus evil, inside versus outside, progress versus stagnation. Social media turns that dichotomy viral. Outrage algorithms feed binary thinking, rewarding absolute conviction. Each retweet, each clap of agreement, becomes reinforcement, dopamine for conformity. The digital age has industrialized the very mechanism that once required isolated compounds. The resemblance extends into relationships too. Gaslighting, once noted in intimate abuse studies, mirrors the same loop of control used by charismatic leaders. One partner rewrites events, questions the other's memory, isolates them from friends, then frames dependence as love. The victim's reality contracts until their world revolves around approval. Therapists draw a straight line from interpersonal gaslighting to cultic conditioning. Small repeated distortions that make autonomy feel unsafe. Whether it's a guru or a lover, the equation stays constant, control disguised as care. So how do we recognize this pattern before it closes in? Survivors and experts identify 4 markers appearing across contexts. First comes dependency, the growing belief that peace or purpose depends on a specific person or ideology. Second is secrecy, inner circles, hidden truths, or information hierarchies that separate insiders from the rest. Third is moral superiority, the conviction that dissent equates to ignorance or evil. And fourth is fear of questioning, when inquiry triggers shame instead of discussion. Whenever these 4 coexist, freedom has already begun to erode. Awareness doesn't mean cynicism. Genuine belonging and mentorship exist. The difference lies in reciprocity. Healthy systems encourage feedback and tolerate uncertainty. Unhealthy ones collapse under it. Dr. Eileen Barker emphasizes a simple test. If doubt feels dangerous, you're not in community, you're in control. That principle applies equally to meditation retreats, startups, and political movements. The form doesn't matter, the feeling does. For spiritual seekers, this realization can sting. It's easy to see manipulation in extremists, harder to face its echo in one's own pursuit of enlightenment. Yet avoiding that discomfort blocks growth. The line between devotion and dependency often blurs within sincere practice. Yoga communities, mindfulness networks, religious congregations, all risk sliding into subtle authoritarian rhythms when charisma substitutes for accountability. The challenge isn't to abandon faith, but to practice discernment, to ask where guidance ends and governance begins. That's the lesson survivors offer. Their stories aren't warnings against belief. They're warnings against surrendering verification. Gail, reflecting years after leaving, said, "What trapped me wasn't his doctrine. It was my need for someone to tell me I was good." That honesty reframes the conversation. The vulnerability that cults exploit is the same one that drives connection. Recognizing influence starts with recognizing hunger. The desire to be seen, guided, absolved. Awareness transforms that need from weakness into compass. Therapists now weave this insight into recovery for both ex-members and ordinary clients facing manipulative systems. They teach relational self-trust, evaluating safety not by ideology, but by bodily response. Genuine influence leaves you expanded. False influence leaves you contracted. After years of command-response living, that distinction becomes intuitive only through practice. Survivors learn to occupy pauses, to notice the micro-moment before agreeing, buying, joining, or worshipping. That pause, says Dr. Jenkinson, is where autonomy hides waiting to be remembered. Beyond the clinical, this mirror reaches culture itself. Modern societies reward certainty, followers, and trends that promise effortless transformation. The cult impulse survives as marketing strategy, branding life philosophies into consumable certainty. The antidote isn't mockery but mindfulness, checking whether empowerment campaigns actually return power. When belonging requires surrendering independent thought, when a brand or movement demands constant affirmation, the mechanics of heaven's gate whisper beneath the hashtags. In everyday relationships, awareness translates into humility. Admitting we're influenceable doesn't make us fragile, it makes us honest. The more sophisticated the manipulation, the more it relies on our denial of vulnerability. Cult leaders and algorithmic curators both thrive on that blindness. Self-awareness short-circuits their design. Each time we ask, "What need is this fulfilling for me?" we reinsert friction into the slide toward conformity. Influence isn't inherently evil, it's the current of society. What differentiates education from indoctrination, mentorship from manipulation, is reciprocity. The moment influence can't tolerate disagreement, it mutates into control. Understanding that continuum is the shield survivors now carry and teach. The goal isn't to build walls against connection, but to maintain windows, clear, open, and reversible. By now, we've followed this story from seduction to surrender, through collapse and recovery. Its final mirror reflects not warning, but possibility. Each human mind contains the circuitry for both devotion and doubt, both obedience and awareness. Darkness enters not through faith, but through forgetfulness, forgetting that truth thrives in tension, that love without freedom decays into control. In recognizing the cultic patterns scattered through everyday life, we reclaim ownership of perception. The same psychology that once enslaved thousands can also awaken millions, if directed inward as examination instead of outward as worship. Spiritual maturity begins when certainty softens into curiosity, when leadership becomes conversation. That's the mirror we usually avoid, seeing how easily we trade thinking for belonging, and how powerful it is to choose both without surrendering either. From obedience to inner authority. In the quiet after everything collapses, realization comes like dawn. Not triumphant, but tender. Sawyer once said, freedom didn't feel free. It felt like standing in a room full of echoes. He had survived the unmaking of his world, yet couldn't celebrate. The mind that once drew comfort from obedience now trembled facing its own choices. It's a paradox every survivor knows. Liberation begins with disorientation. He started rebuilding by asking questions, small ones at first. Which cereal do I like? Why does silence make me tense? Each answer stitched a fragment of identity back together. Over months, those stitches formed something new, a self able to decide without doctrine. I learned that confusion wasn't punishment, he said later. It was proof I was thinking again. That realization transforms trauma into autonomy. From obedience to inner authority. This is the arc at the heart of every recovery. The transition isn't rebellion, it's recognition. What was once external command becomes internal discernment. Psychologists call it safe uncertainty, the ability to tolerate not knowing without collapsing into fear. It's the antithesis of cultic thinking and, paradoxically, the essence of spiritual maturity. When meaning no longer requires control, faith and freedom can coexist. Dr. Gilly Jenkinson reminds her clients that healing doesn't erase vulnerability, it redefines it. Being influenceable isn't weakness, she tells them. It's how we learn. The goal is to choose the influences that feed, not consume. Inner authority doesn't mean isolation. It means consent. Each new belief must pass through self-trust before it enters. Survivors who internalize this principle become guides, translating pain into insight for others still trapped in devotion without direction. Gail, ever the seeker, now teaches mindfulness to help people separate intuition from indoctrination. She begins every session with a disclaimer. If anything I say feels absolute, challenge it. The line always earns nervous laughter, then quiet reflection. She knows certainty can be seductive, even in healing. Her rule, question everything, including me, is the compass that keeps freedom from hardening into another cage. The audience watching these lives might recognize traces of themselves. Most will never join a cult, yet many have obeyed quieter doctrines. Social media idolatries, corporate missions, family myths. The story of Heaven's Gate isn't about fanaticism. It's about the universal hunger for direction. When that hunger goes unquestioned, influence fills the gap. Real protection begins not with suspicion of others, but with intimacy with one's own motives. That's the deeper invitation of this journey, to turn the lens inward. Ask where in your life certainty overshadows curiosity. Ask whose voice replaces your own when fear rises. Awareness doesn't demand abandoning communion or commitment. It insists on participating consciously. Rule by charisma ends the moment the listener looks back at the speaker and says, "I'll think about that." Simple words, but they reclaim the throne of thought. Therapists working with former members speak of a final milestone they call integration, when memories of obedience no longer sting but instruct. Survivors describe waking one day and realizing obedience wasn't the enemy. It was the teacher that revealed what freedom costs. Every bowed head, every silenced question, becomes context for hard-earned discernment. From that soil grows humility without submission, trust without dependency. In reconstructed communities of ex-members, laughter now replaces liturgy. They share meals, stories, and quiet faiths built on transparency. No one demands alignment. Disagreement is welcomed like fresh air. That sound, the uncoerced conversation of people once silenced, is the opposite of indoctrination. It's democracy of the soul. For spiritual seekers drawn to stories like this, the takeaway is neither fear nor cynicism. It's vigilance veined with compassion. Influence will always exist. The task is to remain conscious while moved by it. When belief invites dialogue rather than obedience, when guidance expands awareness instead of shrinking it, faith evolves from possession into partnership. If Sawyer's journey began in surrender and ended in uncertainty, that uncertainty became his cathedral. "I don't trust leaders anymore," he said before pausing with a smile. "But I trust when my breath steadies." That sentence carries the documentary's quiet revelation. Authority reclaimed not through defiance but presence. Freedom, finally, isn't the absence of influence, it's the presence of awareness. The mind once programmed to obey can, with patience, learn to listen instead. And in that listening, something essential reemerges. The inner voice unfiltered by fear, unamplified by charisma. A simple, human knowing that whispers, "Think for yourself, but keep your heart open." That whisper is where every recovery ends, and every true awakening begins.